Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am very, very pleased and honoured to be joined by Mr. Bernard Gloster from Tusla, the CEO of Tusla. Hi, Bernard. How are you?
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Thanks so much for taking the time. I'm very well. Are you well yourself?
Yeah, delighted to be here. Delighted to have the time to talk with you.
Thanks so much, Bernard. So I ask everyone really to kick off by telling me a little bit about themselves.
Sure.
Can you give me a little bit of information about your own background, please, Bernard?
Sure, yeah. So I've been a public servant for over 30 years now. And my career, I guess, really breaks into two parts. The first part of my career was in what's now called social care. And that was predominantly within the former health board context, so even before the days of the HSE. And then second half of my career, I've been a senior manager working right across the health and social service spectrum. So I was a senior manager in the Midwestern Health Board, and then in the HSE, I was a chief officer in the Midwest area of the HSE for many years. And in 2019, very privileged to be appointed to the position of CEO of the Child and Family Agency, or Tusla as it's called, and so here I am 2 years later. So that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour.
Thanks, Bernard. And so with that wealth of experience, you know, the social care practitioner background, and then the senior management for a fair long time, what's your own understanding of the importance of safe, healthy and loving relationships in childhood?
So I guess in so many features of health and personal social services, they are themselves relationship-based services. So maybe there's a bit of a paradox in that to some degree, but they are predominantly, particularly the ones outside of acute healthcare and primary healthcare. Acute and primary healthcare are, of course, correctly driven by science and evidence and medicine, whereas personal social services and care services, whether they're for services for older people, where I worked for many, many years, for people with disabilities, for people with enduring mental health illness, or indeed people who are generally unwell, and for children, probably the significance of relationships comes out in so many different ways. The relationship now of the service provider to that person, but more importantly, the relationships that person has in their family life or their extended network, because very often personal social service providers like Tusla or other providers will rely on that network of people to provide the real support. We might enable it to some degree, we might support it, we might oversee it, we might contribute to it, but it is ultimately that network of people. And so that's in the construct of supporting people. But I guess before people ever come into contact with state services and with personal social services, they are people who live and are born into and grow up in a family and in a community, and so on. And probably at every turn that we see it in the course of our work, those relationships are so important. And often they're important to go back and explore them to understand the context of where a person might be at now. So really, I think essentially by virtue of the fact that people connect with each other, that probably states the obvious in terms of the importance.
Thank you, Bernard. Can you tell me a bit about the mission of Tusla, the Child and Family Agency, please, and then what your own vision is for it as CEO?
Sure, and just as I look to it here, I looking at our corporate plan for the next 3 years, and people I think often think corporate plans are somewhat glossy brochures that say a lot and don't say anything, and it's hard sometimes to work out from them what do they actually mean and what do they say. We put an awful lot of effort this year into this phase of the 3-year plan to really simply say, what is it we do? What is it we're going to do? And how will we know we've done it? And so there are so many priorities we could pick from, but we had to pick certain ones. But before you get to that, we went out and asked people questions about it. And so people said to us, it's not clear why the agency does what it does and the good that it wants to achieve for people. And so we updated our vision and our mission statements to try to articulate that. And so when I look at the mission now of Tusla, it's dedicated and committed to working in partnership. There's the relationships again, with children, with families, and with communities, to ensure that children in need or at risk of harm are supported, protected, and connected to people who can safeguard and promote their well-being throughout their lives. So again, there are so many words in there and so many adjectives that are relationship based. They're all connected. Yes. They're all relationship connected, partnership, and so on. And the vision, I guess, really out of all of that at a strategic level for the agency is that families and communities are empowered and strengthened to keep children safe and nurtured, recognizing a child's right to protection, stability, and the support of a family and a community network. And there we go again with the network and the importance of that. So, and I guess if you want to take that then down to my sort of level as the CEO, that's the board's articulation of the plan. But if you want to take that down to my level, well, I mean, my vision has to be one that's not about a big bang puff of smoke change. That denies the context. It denies the reality of where Irish childcare and family support services, and indeed health services, personal social services, have come from. And it's probably foolhardy to think there's big bang puff of smoke type of change. And so really my vision is one of where there's an absolute visible evidence for the public in general, so they can have confidence that we're there, for the people whose lives we interact with. And some of the people whose lives we interact with, we're not very welcome in their lives because of the nature of what we do. But for many, of course, we are. And that's the hidden part of what we do. Thousands of people are receiving support from our family support services. And so my vision is that for those people, for the public, for the people who interact with us, and particularly for our staff, for the professionals who are with us, for the professionals who might think about coming to work with us, and indeed for the people who are leaving us, that all of them can see some steady progress. I call it continuous improvement, but steady progress in building on what we learn about what's good, that works, what we learn about our mistakes and our problems. And the definition of a good personal social service for me is not one that doesn't have mistakes. They do. Sure. Because of their nature. But it's a good personal social service for me is one that has the ability to be reflective, and in being reflective, to take that reflection and translate it into some type of positive action that shows we learn, and as we do that, we continuously improve. And that's really the vision. From my perspective as a CEO, there's lots of parts to that vision, of course. But I'm here 2 years now, and I'm due to be here for 5, so 3 more years, and 2 years goes very fast. So you do have to pick the parts that you believe will make the most significant change, not just for now, for the future. And so when I came to Tusla, I identified 3 priorities with the board and with the minister, and they were the quality of the service, the staffing context, and the public confidence. And if you flip that over, then I have 3 programs of change that are going on. I try to stay away from the word reform, but sometimes we all slip into it. And whatever about reform, I certainly try to stay away from the word transformation. Right. But we have 3 programs of change at a very significant level that are well underway, and they are linked to the 3 priorities. They are practice, culture, and structure. And I don't believe in changing the structure of an agency, which we're right in the middle of, unless you change the culture. Sure. And I don't believe denying the culture is in any way effective. And I think if you create the right culture, if you create a much more enabling structure, you can improve the practice, and the practice goes to the heart of the relationships.
Yeah, they're all very interlinked, all right. So how difficult is it then to lead and embed strategic and cultural change in a state agency really like Tusla, where there's a hell of a lot of media scrutiny, and also there can be very little public or political tolerance even for error, Bernard? And as you rightly say, we cannot eliminate error. It will happen in any service. But there's just particularly, I suppose, because the stakes are high with the work that you do, it can be a fairly hostile environment, perhaps, within which you operate.
It is at times very hostile, and the unfortunate nature of that, of course, is that unfortunately removes any lens or visibility of all that is good. There is so much good in the work that the people who come into Tusla do every day of the week. There's so much good in the organizations we work with, over 700 agencies. And there is so much good in the people and the families and the communities and the children we work with, who may be experiencing dreadful trauma in their lives at a particular point in time. But there are stereotypical views in a minority. And you have to remember, I think, I often say about all public services I've ever worked in, the silent majority are the people who know that it's reasonable, but they are the silent majority. There is perhaps a minority view that is more hostile and that isn't reasonable. I am absolutely 100% clear that it's important we are able to hear criticism, that we're able to afford people fair process for their complaints to be investigated and explored, including with a level of independence. I think most people would have no idea the level of oversight that goes into an agency like Tusla from outside, and all of that is there. But nonetheless, there still is that level of hostility. You mentioned the word Tusla, and there are a cohort of people who just Tusla equals bad, and therefore they'll jump on that and seize on that, and that's okay. I think once we understand that for what it is, then that's that part. But the part about leading change in a complex environment like this, and it doesn't matter if it's Tusla or indeed another public service body, there's a view that there's no change or there's no desire for change in public services, that we're all sort of fat cat public servants that just sit around from 9 to 5 and go in on a Friday and forget about the people that we're supposed to provide services to, and all of that. And look, I mean, that is what it is. But the reality is, leading complex change in any organization, from my perspective, requires the leader to essentially do three things. One is to be 100% clear with people about what exactly it is that's changing and why. And even if people disagree with the why, it's very important to tell them the why. The second thing is to recognize that change, even where it's motivated by the best possible evidence and rationale, change is difficult, and it is very difficult for all of us, because it disrupts the status quo. It disrupts the comfort zone that we find ourselves in as people, and so that's difficult. And the third thing, I remember hearing an observation a couple of years ago. I was doing an academic program, and I remember hearing an observation which I thought was really interesting, and it was around the whole subject of the traditional literature on resistance to change. And a much more modern day interpretation and school of thought is that people don't resist change, but they do mourn loss.
Right.
And again, is that a reason not to change? No, it's not. But it certainly is a reason to be aware of and to empathize with. And I think it does make the integrity of the change all the more reasonable. After that, it is all of the normal nuts and bolts of change. It is negotiation, it's decision making, it's industrial relations, it's lots of that good stuff that takes up loads and loads of time. But it comes back to those basics.
Sorry, Bernard, for cutting across you. Is it important to listen to staff as well when you're going into a change?
Completely.
Trying to convince them, I suppose.
Yes.
Of the why.
Yeah, and so if I take the structure of the agency of Tusla, we're changing it in two parts. The first change involves 11 posts out of 5,000, and that's about the central corporate governance of the agency. So it's quite small. It's quite big for the people affected, but it's quite small for the major parties. The second part is we're creating 6 operating regions around the country. And apart from having 6 regional chief officers, we have said that we're not going to prescribe the structure below upload those without hearing from everybody.
Okay.
So we've now started a process called Structure Part 2. And over the next 3 to 4 months, we will be looking at the as is, which is different in every part of the country. And we'll be asking people for their views, whether they're clerical officers, whether they're social workers, social care workers, therapists, a very small number of psychologists, receptionists. We'll be asking everybody what they think. The problem with that, of course, is that if you come and ask me what I think, and I tell you that I think you should have 2 there and 3 there, and you come back at the end and say, no, we're going to have 1 there and 4 there, well, then, of course, I reserve the right to say, so much for your consultation, because that's a human thing.
Yeah.
But yes, it is important to listen to people. It is important to hear what they have to say. And it's important, again, if you go back to that piece I said about change at the start, you have to be clear with people what it is you're changing and why.
Yeah.
And that consultation doesn't always mean agreement.
No.
But what it does mean is clarity.
Sure.
And after that, everybody moves on. And the hardest thing I get, it's quite easy for people to agree and commit. The hardest thing for any of us, I think, is to disagree and commit. And that's where organizations become complex entities. Yeah.
Indeed. So people like myself, the ordinary members of the public, I guess, will be familiar with Tusla's involvement in childcare proceedings, which occur if the family dynamics are injurious to healthy child development. Bernard, what is the threshold for intervention here?
So I know you're going to be talking to one of my colleagues, Ailey, who's a service director, and Ailey's a social worker and former social work manager. So I think she'll be able to give you perhaps the more technical aspect of that. The part about threshold, where I've been going to, so I mentioned we're changing practice. So one of the main areas of practice I want to change is what do we provide to people who are concerned about children and families, and what do we provide to families about whom there is a concern at what we call the front door. And the front door is the point at which a referral is made to Tusla. It could be by a mandated reporter like a teacher or a guard or a nurse or a doctor, or it could be by a family themselves. And there has been, I suppose, understandably for recent years, a very specific focus on the child protection and welfare aspect of that, particularly child protection. And there's a whole process by which those concerns get screened and assessed and followed up and so on. And then we kind of have out there a family support service. And sometimes families will end up being referred into that, and sometimes they won't. And what happens is there isn't a consistency around that across the country. So what we're now doing is we're changing the front door of Tusla, so that every service, whether it's our education welfare service, because we do education welfare, whether it's our family support service, or whether it's our child protection service, it'll all be essentially in the one construct. And the reason for it is this: we would rather talk about pathways for children than thresholds.
Okay.
So we're the state child protection and family support service. I take the family support part of that as seriously as any other, albeit the child protection has a very particular emphasis that needs constant watching. But like, we had over 60,000 referrals last year, and not all of them are child abuse referrals. Not all of them are in those delineated categories of physical, emotional, sexual abuse or neglect. Many of them are families struggling in difficulty, finding it hard to come through the day without that sense of stress and chaos and so on. And when those referrals are made to us, I guess we have to focus first on the ones that require the immediate protective response. But we do have to create those pathways, and therefore we can say, sorry, you haven't met the threshold for intervention. You may not meet the threshold for social work protective intervention, and Ailey can talk to you about that. But in my view, every child and family meets the threshold for consideration.
Right, okay.
They won't all get a service because that would be impossible. You could not provide service to 60,000 people in 1 year. But what you could do, and what you can do, and what we often do, is go back to the start of the conversation, the network of that family, the community, the relationship. That's where perhaps the pathway might start. A targeted family support service that we fund or resource or provide ourselves, that might be the next level. And obviously the most significant level is the harm intervention piece and the protective piece. So yes, there are thresholds for different things, but I do want us to have a system where there isn't a threshold to be considered.
I get you. And you're sitting in front of a poster there, Bernard, about prevention, partnership and family support. I'm personally quite a big believer in prevention and early intervention. Can you just tell me a little bit about that focus of work, the prevention?
So that program has started long before I came to Tusla, and in fact had its origins probably in the pre-Tusla days when the Children and Family Services were in the HSE. But essentially, it became a formalised program over a number of years to create a whole range of options and supports for children, right down at infant level, parent support, and wide-ranging supports available to people, and then starting to funnel a little bit more and more into specific target groups where there may be additional levels of vulnerability. Separate to the PPFS program, then you have the Child Protection and Welfare Strategy program in Tusla, and that's the one that's more focused on the response to the child protection piece and the harm consideration piece. So what we're now done is, because of the success achieved, the progress achieved in both of those programs, we're now collapsing those programs into our practice change to try to achieve consistency across the country rather than have national programs. Because one of the things about Tusla is you can have national leadership, but you really do have to have local ownership because of the nature of the work that we do. So that's what I said about the front door. I don't want the front door of Tusla to be just about harm and child protection, even though that has to be our priority. I want it to be about the pathways for all those families, be they at the stage of prevention or at the stage of justifiable intervention.
Okay. And so you mentioned briefly the trauma that families can sometimes be immersed in earlier in our conversation. I gave a talk myself a few years back at the PPFS conference on the role of relationships in preventing and healing trauma. And since then, there've actually been quite a lot more calls from a range of fields about how frontline service providers and systems need to become trauma informed, along with more focus on the healing power of relationships. What are your own views on this, Bernard? Is Tusla working towards becoming trauma informed and responsive?
And so I get all of the calls that you're talking about, and all of the representations from different groups and people and providers. And isn't that a wonderful thing? I think it's a wonderful thing that we have such a rich and diverse tapestry of people who are creative, who are professional, who have insight, who go and study, who research, who practice, who bring research into practice and practice into research. And there are examples of that increasing all of the time. The concerns I have, so I fully subscribe to, can I just say at the start, I fully subscribe to what my understanding is and what I think is generally defined as a trauma-informed approach. I think it is a fundamentally different way of understanding and responding to somebody who really has a lot of difficulties, a lot of distress, a lot of challenges, and a lot of different things going on in their lives. And I think it's a fundamentally different way from what it would have been 25 or 30 years ago, when I suppose state services were very much more rescue, recovery, rescue, protect, rescue, recovery models that didn't take account of the context leading up to that. I often say to journalists now when they interview me about the children Tusla struggles to be able to respond to, and for which we get reported in the papers. Tusla can't respond to every child in its own. All services in society have to try to do that. But I do often say to journalists, people are very quick to talk to us, I think, about our response or our inadequate response to somebody when they come to our attention or come into our care. Very few people want to talk about what happened to somebody before they came to our attention, before they came into our care. Very often the root of their trauma, the attachment to separations and so on. And so I think we have to have an awareness of it. So I welcome the fact there's a really strong conversation about it. I have a concern about it, and I'll be very honest, and that is that I hear so many different versions and interpretations of it. Right. Of course, it's, well, which one is right? And so, you know, I think you would certainly know from your professional insight that there are different schools of thought emerge in every thematic approach. There are schools of thought about nursing and about various things, and there are schools of thought about social work, and there are schools of thought about social care, and now there will be schools of thought about trauma. And what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see the professional community that relies on, promotes or advocates for a trauma-informed approach. I'd like to see a collective, simplified set of core principles to that approach. What a great idea. And then let all of the different providers use their different methodologies linked to those core principles. That to me would bring us to a level of consistency that I would find easier for Tusla to be able to embrace that into where we are and where we're trying to get to. So last week I met a provider of a trauma-informed approach, and a provider does a lot of work with Tusla, and I made this very point to them. If we're going to really integrate trauma-informed consciousness into professional practice and into an agency's disposition towards the people it responds to, and you could say the exact same about a lot of adult services. So let's not think it's just a children focused issue. For sure not. But if we're going to integrate that in, well, I think it's beholden on all of us to say that there might be different styles and approaches to that. But the piece I hang on to most is, can a trauma-informed service support foster carers, support parents of children at home, or support professional staff dealing with children, so that the life of the child is trauma-informed, rather than the traditional off down to a clinical appointment once a week or once a fortnight. So it is about making it normal, making it part of the toolkit. But I really would like to see a set of core principles agreed amongst that community, because I do find there are lots of variations, and people will say to me, oh, well, that model isn't really trauma now, you know, that's not, I mean, but if you come over here and look at mine, it's much better. And look, everybody advocates for style, and I get that, and I don't think we should try to quench that. But I think we do need to have maybe just a shared understanding of the core components of a trauma-informed approach, and then we should make that normal business. Yeah, I think that's a fabulous idea. Makes a lot of sense to me, because you're right, there are these variations, and some don't emphasize attachment, you know, or they're not very neurodevelopmentally aware. So you're bang on there. That would be very helpful to services in making the investment actually in training, even, you know, because training is costly in whatever area. You mentioned as well just there, Bernard, and I think it's so important, the impact on staff of working around trauma and with traumatized children and traumatized caregivers oftentimes. And, you know, child protection, social work is highly stressful. So I believe social workers can be subject to verbal abuse and, you know, threatening behavior by parents maybe who perhaps go into fight mode because they're frightened of what's going to happen to them. And how does Tusla then buffer staff from secondary traumatic stress and overwhelm to prevent them from leaving, you know, early? It's a difficult question, but yeah, there are a couple of parts to that. I think, Jane, I think I've rarely met a professional in the course of my career, both in Tusla and previously. I've rarely met a professional who doesn't go out of their way to empathize with and understand when somebody is behaving or acting or responding from a very, very distressed state. I think most professionals, no matter how hard those conversations and instances are, they really do try to demonstrate that empathy. And I think it's later on that impact you're talking about may be there for them. That's the first thing. The second thing is and you'd see it reported in media reports, we work with a lot of, a lot of children who come from really, really difficult social contexts, whether that's influenced by drugs, or by crime, or by multiple forms of abuse. And that tells in the way they can and can't connect on any one day with the people around them. That has an impact. And so in those two contexts, I think we have to find every way with employee assistance approaches to support people. We have an employee assistance program in Tusla. We essentially have 24-hour counselling available to staff who would need it. And we have, I think, a pretty good understanding of the more modern day version of occupational health approaches rather than that traditional, again, tick a box medical intervention. So certainly that's there. Is that ever enough? Well, it's look, let's be honest, when somebody is involved in a serious incident, when they're injured, when they're targeted in any way, you can support. Can you completely resolve or heal or bring back from that? Not all of the time. It is risky work. There's no question of that. So I think we continue to find ways to work with that. The part perhaps that I've been quoted quite extensively in the media in the last couple of weeks on this, and I spoke to an Oireachtas committee last November about this in the context of the wider issue of recruitment and retaining of staff. And while it's not always the case, and it certainly isn't the biggest part of the retention problem, child protection statutory work is difficult work. It's not for everybody. I wonder how our staff do it sometimes. I really do. It's very complex work. But the one part that I as an agency, I have no tolerance for, and I will strongly advocate for, and I will strongly challenge. And that's the people who deliberately choose. And I don't mean people now in a distressed kind of mode, but people who deliberately choose to target violence or aggression towards our staff. And they do that. And it does happen. And a lot of people would not understand that, as an agency, we would have taken steps last year to enhance the security of a staff member's home. We would have taken serious litigation steps to restrain somebody who presented as a real serious credible threat to a member of staff. We have had staff who've been personally filmed, followed, their cars followed, their registration plates published online, where they live, names of their family and so on, all in a pure targeted intimidatory fashion. I'll be very honest, I do not accept there is any justification in any part of society for that. There are enough of avenues for people to vindicate their complaints or their grievances. There is enough of understanding for people who perhaps in a very distressed state don't have that immediate control. But there cannot be tolerance for accepting that public servants doing their work, in this case child protection staff, but indeed in any case, there cannot be an acceptance, there cannot be an acquiescence to that. And the best form of support I think we can give people in that context is by calling that out, by standing up for them, by challenging social media companies and by challenging others. But at its core, at the end of the day, when all that's done and said and done, whatever supports we can give to staff, we would give to them. And again, the relationships with their peers is sometimes perhaps the most beneficial, the relationships with their supervisors, the culture of care and that disposition of care. Could I be assured it's consistently always there? Probably not. I think the human dynamic just makes that difficult. But I do wonder, and I do worry for staff, when they find themselves in those very stressful situations. I do wonder about them when they put their heads on their pillow at night.
Yeah, indeed. I've just another couple. I'm conscious of your time, Bernard, but I've another couple for you.
Sure.
that one actually, that your answer there actually ties quite well into this next question, because I'm working with the rep team in UL on a project to do with trying to help young people who are involved in criminal networks to safely exit them and to avail of personal development opportunities. But it's a very complex environment. And one of the difficulties now, Tusla is a project partner in this, is GDPR and data sharing. That's one of the challenges. Can you identify, as someone who's involved, I'm sure, in many kind of multi-agency type arrangements, can you identify other barriers, I suppose, to multi-agency working and how we overcome them? Because there's a lovely phrase from Otto Scharmer where he says, we collectively produce outcomes that nobody wants. And I think it's really interesting in terms of complex systems and these ginormous wicked problems.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair to poor old GDPR, I live with that challenge every day, and I must say it's exceptionally frustrating at times, because now, you know, there are aspects of how GDPR is interpreted, and I want to be clear, I fully subscribe to GDPR, but there are aspects of how it's interpreted that really you couldn't do right for wrong at times, and you'd wonder. And I meet people who are adopted, who get such heavily redacted information driven by a concern around GDPR, and not always does that follow through. But to be fair on the question you're asking, I think about interagency working and joint working and sharing. That challenge was called out long before GDPR came onto the statute books, and you know, if you go back on a review of any of the types of inquiries into cases that go wrong, or abuse cases, or and again, this is what I keep saying to people, this isn't just in the case of children. Look at it in any social service context that you like. Look at it in the history of disability services. And so every social care context has this challenge. And if you look at the inquiries, you go back to 1993 and you read the very profound comments of the later to become Miss Justice Catherine McGuinness in the Kilkenny incest investigation. You read the Kelly Fitzgerald case. You read all of the different cases, the length and breadth of our history. 9 times out of 10, they point to a dimension of shared or interagency requirement. Read the Ombudsman's judgments in individual cases he's investigated, the Molly case, the Jack case. Read all of those and you will find the same thing. What is that obstacle about? What causes that obstacle? Well, it's not just GDPR, it's lots of things. And I think when a state sets up a statutory agency, the statutory agency might well be viewed to be the solution to the particular challenge. But by virtue of the creation of that statutory agency, there is an unintended creation of another boundary. You can have all the partnership agreements, all the shared working that you like, but if I have a statutory responsibility to do something and my colleagues in the Gardaí or in the HSE have the same statutory responsibility applying to what they do, the first thing you're going to do is try to meet your statutory responsibility. Because the state and the Oireachtas has said, this is what you must do for the people and on behalf of the people. And so your attention is focused on that, your resources focused on that. If your demand is heavier than your available resource to deal with stuff, you're focused on that. So we are all the time internally focused on the challenges we have. And while we have a full spirit of, and maybe an individual commitment to integration, it's dictated often by that availability. And I think we've made a lot of good progress in that. We certainly made progress in the disability sector over the last 15 months in the HSE, and my colleague Paul Reid and I have met and discussed it a number of times. And we put in place really practical enablers to improving that from what it was. It still has challenges, of course, but it's substantially improved. And so I think there are organizational boundaries created by the fact that we're trying to respond but we're all trying to respond in many different ways. I wouldn't want that to deny the really good interagency work that is done every day of the week. And I don't just mean at the softer end in terms of community focus process, but there is really difficult, complex case management work done every day between organisations like the Gardaí, like the HSE, like Tusla, and they are at the most complex end. So, and the wonderful thing I find in that is the ability of the professionals sometimes to get around and get over those obstacles.
Right.
And that's where the creativity of good social services comes from. And I guess part of what guys like me, like CEOs, have to do is to enable some of that flexibility of approach.
Right.
So that people are able to find the ways. I know we would have had staff out last night in the middle of the night working with a very small number of specific young people who literally cannot be grounded anywhere.
Right.
And that work would have been done in full conjunction with the Gardaí, with hospital staff, with other people. So there is real effort there that often isn't visible, but there perhaps are always systemic barriers. If you go into the health context particularly, and you look at some of the research, including in Ireland, around integration, it's the holy grail that so many jurisdictions have tried to achieve over decades. And again, I don't think it's an end point we get to. I don't think it's created by policies and procedures alone. It has to be created by a disposition and a willingness.
Yes, and relationships are also important there, aren't they, Bernard?
Completely there. Well, they're the entire basis really of, 5 agencies can sit around a table at a meeting and they can have a protocol. And that's really important. It's good for governance and it's good for transparency. But if the 5 people around that table don't either have or don't have the will to have an effective working relationship, well...
Yeah, and trust
going to come
one
up
another
short.
too.
It's going to come up short,
Yeah, thank you. Just 2 other short ones. You recently were reported in the Irish Examiner that you were concerned about Tusla dependency on private businesses to provide residential childcare. Why do we need private business, Bernard? Because they're profit-driven enterprises to provide such facilities.
Okay, so again, if I go back to the context beyond children and go to personal social services, and if you look at it throughout Ireland and throughout Europe, there's a couple of factors. We have private care in the nursing home sector for older people. The majority of care is private. We have private care, not to a significant amount, but not to a small amount, in disability residential services. And we have private care now in children's residential services. So it's not unique to childcare. That's the first thing. There are very mixed views about it and about its use. They're private home health services and so on. I think it's important to stand back for a second. The first thing I would want to say is there are a lot of private providers who provide very good care, and so I don't think we should demonize care and good services just because they happen to be in the commercial world.
Okay.
There are private hospitals that people like you or I could go to tomorrow because we have health insurance if we have it, and so on. So it is a feature. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are very significant European procurement directives that mean when state funding is being used to buy or purchase services, that must be open in competitive terms to people to apply to do that work. So the traditional notion of just giving it to an NGO itself has become less so.
Okay.
The third thing is a lot of NGOs originally founded on the premise of religious orders have withdrawn from the provision of care. And so something had to take that place. Thankfully, the ending of large institutions means lots more small houses. So there are lots more centres and somebody has to provide those. But the one thing I will certainly say, and there are many concerns and challenges around using private provision too much. The one thing I will say is that the level of dependency we have on it is not something I'd be comfortable with. I'm quite comfortable with it in foster care because it's the minority dependency. I'm not comfortable with it in residential care because we're more than 50% dependent on it in terms of our residential childcare population. That is not a good level of dependency. And with no disrespect to any of those providers, they could collapse or go out of the market tomorrow. And they all have children and young people that we're responsible for. And so that is not a dependency I'm comfortable with. And that's hence my comments in the Examiner. And we're working our way through that. I suspect that'll be long after my time when it comes to full fruition. But it is something we need to be very careful of.
Okay. Final question, Bernard, and thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. What can politicians and policymakers do to prioritise safe, healthy relationships for all children in Ireland and indeed their caregivers?
I think, to be fair to politicians, they get a lot of bad press too. They perhaps, like me, would say some of it deserves, some not so. But again, behind all of the construct, I get representations quite often from members of the Oireachtas, either on behalf of individual people or community organisations, or I get parliamentary questions. And to be fair, I have to say that in the majority, those questions or representations come from a place of genuinely wanting to understand, wanting to support, wanting to help. They come from a place of care. And so I don't think we're as badly off as we might think we are in that context, if that's the makeup of the political spectrum. That's the first thing. When those elected representatives or the parties they're in form governments, I think they carry that disposition with them. They do, of course, have to take into account lots of other considerations. But where I think Ireland has taken a lot of lead is if you look at the context of the development of legislation, whether it's childcare legislation, whether it's healthcare legislation, mental health legislation, disability legislation, and all of the various protections for people. When you look at the challenge of providing the legislation and making sure it's constitutional, but on the other hand, wanting it to be good for people, I think there's a fair reflection of wanting to understand the importance of relationships between people and society, people and their families, people and their communities, people and public services. I think there's a fair attempt to reflect that, and I don't see the deficit at the legislative policy end. I think the deficit is probably in all of us having an awareness that in the midst of our policies and our procedures and all of the governance things we need to do and have to do and properly should do, but in the midst of all of that, as public servants particularly, there are people at the end of our decisions. And those people at the end of our decisions, they have people in their lives, be they friends or family or whatever, and those relationships are probably part of the key to us being maybe even a little bit more successful at providing the services that we want to provide.
Okay. Well, Bernard Gloster, CEO of Tusla, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's been an honor and I've learned an awful lot. I had some idea about Tusla and the work you were doing, but it's very interesting to hear about your change agenda. So thank you for taking the time, Bernard.
Thanks, Jane. Pleasure to talk to you.
This was Law and Justice with me, Jane Mulcahy, on the topic of Relationships Matter with Bernard Gloster, CEO of Tusla. Thank you, Bernard.